Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, Khumbudzo Ntshabeni, is adamant that her department has done all it could to deliver full broadcast digital migration for the nation. This morning we ask, is South Africa really ready? Well, hello and welcome to Media and Society on SABC News, independent and impartial. My name is Naledi Moleo. Now, this is where we look at the intersection between media and audiences. Of course, this show is not complete without your say, so do connect with us via our social media channels and share your views and concerns about how the media works and what we feed you. The hashtag to use on Twitter is SABC Media and Society, or give us a call on 011-714-6841 or 6842. Let's get into our top story for this morning. And here's that top story today. Over 1,000 of our South African National Defence Force members have been deployed to neighbouring Mozambique, and this is to help fend off a terrorist insurgency that's going all the way back to 2017. It's in the province of Cabo Delgado. Now, thousands of people have been killed so far. Well, some of the latest to come out of Mozambique is that the country has passed a bill that could see people face 12 to 16 years in prison if they publish classified information about terrorism. Meanwhile, national media oversight body, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, believes that this bill is repressive and could limit the work that can be done by journalists to tell stories about terrorism and terrorism acts. This morning, we will unpack that story as we look at how journalists are covering terrorism on the continent. Well, our producer, Leven Mhlari, caught up with the South African cameraman, Mishak Dube, who is currently in South Sudan, and he shared his experience of covering terrorism or conflict in the continent. He started asking Dube, who works for an international broadcaster, about the impact of the anti-terror bill on journalism that was passed by the Mozambican parliament. Let's take a look.
Very sad moment, you know. Once a nation takes a step like that to censor what information can be brought out, I think it's a very sad opportunity for the country to open up itself for help and to even help its own people by the world seeing what's happening in it. As a journalist, I believe that when you go out there to cover a story, you know, you go out there with no fear. You don't take sides. So if you are really believing in a story that you need to get out to the world, it's worth getting arrested. You know, it's worth, you know, going through that danger, as long as the word that you're saying or what you're reporting on is true.
You have been in several countries working as a camera person across the continent. Can you please share your experience with us?
I've covered many conflicts throughout the continent. Mostly I've covered West and East of Africa. I remember covering the suicide bomber in Nairobi. Also covering the attack that happened at the university in Garissa, where hundreds of students were basically slaughtered. You know, when you go into these stories, you don't know what to expect. You get there on an idea that you want to get out to the world, you know, to report, to find a witness, to find out the history of the person who might have done this, to find out the history of that area. And it becomes difficult too, because, you know, not every country wants to open itself up to the media for them to see the chaos that's happening in the country. You get officials that, you know, there's a lot of red tape. You know, being a cameraman, everything is visual. So if you don't have the visuals, it does not work.
Take us through the preparations that you do when you go out to cover a story that involves terrorists or attacks.
You prepare yourself by, usually they're breaking stories, so it's always rush. But you prepare yourself on what security do you have there? Where are you staying? If you're in danger, how can you get out of that country? You know, so you have to look at all those things to put yourself and the crew at safety. Not everything goes according to plan, but having a plan is better than not having a plan.
What keeps you going as a camera person when going to a war zone area?
You'd be surprised how many people don't even know what's happening in their neighboring countries. So for me, going out and telling those stories and capturing those moments is breaking through to one more person just to let them know that there is conflict in the other side of the world. There is terrorism. It does exist. We need to be aware of our surroundings. And it obviously has to come to a stop. And if we do not report on these kind of stories in a good way, we are letting basically just eat itself up.
Okay, I remember you and other, I think 2 journalists were detained in Swaziland. Besides that, in a situation where, while busy covering a story where they are terrorists and then being held hostage by them.
Honestly speaking, I haven't been held hostage by any terrorists. But I've been in quite a number of close calls where, you are busy filming and you're forced to leave immediately. I remember a time even leaving my tripod behind because things were that bad. Places like Somalia, when you talk about Somalia, you're talking about a country which I would say it's everybody's free flow. And there, as soon as you land at that airport, you're a target. And being a target doesn't mean that you're a target to a terrorist only. You're a target to somebody who might be wanting to kidnap you, or somebody who might be trying to prove a point to whatever country you may be coming from, be it South Africa, America, or even Europe. And that's the saddest part, is that as journalists, as soon as you set foot in a place, there are a lot of people who already know that you're there and what you're there for. So it's always about watching your surroundings.
Okay. Michel Dube, thank you so much for your time, and stay safe, my brother.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting discussion there on how media operates in the coverage of terrorism on the continent. We're going to unpack it a little bit more on the other side of this. Stay with us. Welcome back to Media and Society. Well, remember to join the discussion. You can do so by giving us a call on 011-714-6841. On Twitter, the hashtag to use is SABC Media Society. Well, we're continuing our discussion on how the media covers terrorism on the African continent. We're joined by Erisino de Salema, who is an advocate and journalist, joining us live now from Mozambique. Erisino, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think the first place to start is, how close are you to Cabo Delgado, where we see a lot of the insurgency taking place? And when last were you there, what does the scene look like in the area at the moment?
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Actually, since October 2017 up to now, Cabo Delgado has changed a lot due to these terrorism attacks. Actually, yesterday when the president of Mozambique, Mr. Filipe was addressing the country on the Independence Day, he said that there are some advances in the fight against terrorism, and he stressed out that so far there isn't a single location or district or place that is controlled by the terrorists. Actually, that is true, but maybe it's not relevant when it comes to terrorism and not conventional wars. For example, some districts like Palma, like Anquabe, like Mocimboa da Praia, a lot of citizens have fled those districts and moved to the capital state of Cabo Delgado, Pemba, or to some provinces around the northern area of Mozambique, in the cases of Nampula and the Niassa, meaning that the simple fact, the perception people do have that they are not secure, that they may be attacked anytime, doesn't, let's say, allow them to stay at their districts, at their normal home places, etc., etc. So the situation is very complicated, and nowadays, in the last 2 weeks, there were some attacks in districts. I mean, in Ankwabe is up south, meaning that the terrorists have made an attack now some less than 100 kilometers far away from Pemba, which is the capital city. A lot of people fled to Pemba, adding to what was already there. A lot of pressure over the city, which was not designed to host a lot of people. Being true that a lot of humanitarian action is happening in the ground, but it is also true that there are a lot of challenges, mainly in what refers to women and the children. Yeah, so this is what I would say in terms of describing the situation at large.
Yeah, you're not painting a pretty picture at all, and you're talking essentially to us about the rampant spread of terrorism acts in Mozambique. And then we see the Mozambican government then pass the anti-terror bill, which is interesting because the bill itself essentially puts you at risk as a journalist if you are to publish information or considered classified information on terrorism. Is this the information that you've just given me right now? Will it be difficult for you to continue giving me this information moving forward?
Of course. I totally subscribe to what you have just said. It is very problematic for a democratic country, for a country which is governed by the principle of the rule of law, to approve such laws. Actually, the law, which has just been signed by the president some three days ago, is problematic to the extent that it stresses out that those, including journalists, who publish information which is not confirmed, which is not true, will be prosecuted and will be called to responsibility due to that situation. The fact here is that as journalists, what we do is that, of course, we struggle to report based on the truth, on the facts, but in such a situation like this, we deal with sources, we deal with people who are in the ground, we talk to people who are even part of the army, people who are working for humanitarian organizations, and sometimes we do go to the ground and check what is out there, but it is very problematic in a country that has got a press law which preserves the right of confidentiality, the right of anonymity, to have such a bill saying that the journalists will be taken to court in case they publish information which is not true. And the question here is, who is the gatekeeper of the truth in this case? It's a matter of fact that those who report on Cabo Delgado, mainly on the casualties, mainly on what is not positive for the army, for the government, for the state, are those who work for independent media and not those who are working for, let's say, government-controlled media. Yeah. So what I think is that this bill might be aimed at controlling, at opposing formal censorship to independent media, which is very problematic, because even in a context of a war, of the terrorism attacks, journalists aren't part of any side. They are there just to report the truth. They are there just to make effective the principle which says that the people have right to information.
Yeah, Erisino, let me ask you. You asked an important question when you said, who are the gatekeepers of the truth? Why do you think that the Mozambican government would want to pass a bill that essentially makes it difficult for journalists to cover what is unfolding with terrorism in the country when it is such a big problem?
Well, I don't have, let's say, a definitive opinion on that, but my perception is that the government is not happy with some media reports, some independent media reports, telling the things as they are, telling the truth in the ground, and after failing to use propaganda, to pose obstacles to journalists to report the truth. Now, eventually, this law was approved, proposed by the government and approved by the parliament, so that the journalists call to themselves a sort of censorship, self-censorship when they report on Cabo Delgado, which is very problematic. So from now on, things will never be the same in my point of view, mainly for the Mozambican-based journalists, as the law may be used by the government as to intimidate, as to pose conditions of independent reporting on the situation in Cabo Delgado.
Unfortunately, the insurgency in Cabo Delgado has also cost Mozambique very many civilian lives, and I'm concerned particularly around how civilians will then be updated on how to keep themselves safe. I mean, how does this bill then impact the safety of civilians in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique?
Well, it's true that the situation is very problematic. It's creating problems on civilians, etc. And all of us, Mozambicans and even non-Mozambicans in the country, are supporting all the efforts aimed at curbing the terrorism, combating the terrorism. But that one cannot be done sacrificing, posing restrictions of a fundamental right, which is press freedom. So, while I understand and agree that the civilians are in a very complicated situation, as journalists have rights, those rights are enshrined in the Constitution, in the press freedom law, in some international instruments relating to reporting on war zones, etc., etc. So I don't think it is reasonable for the country to approve such a bill, such a law, clearly restricting the freedom of the press to report on the situation, in this case in Cabo Delgado.
Let's bring in a terrorism expert rather. We're joined now by Jasmine Opperman, who is an independent consultant for the extremism Southern Africa. Sorry for that. Jasmine, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I mean, what do you make of this anti-terror bill essentially putting a limit on how much journalists can do to cover the situation of terrorism in Cabo Delgado?
Good morning, Naledi, and good morning to your viewers. I think it is of utmost concern. I do think, and I do agree with Eric in terms of the sensitivities of a battlefield reporting, but at the end of the day, there's a history behind this. Government has always been sensitive towards journalists exposing the realities of Cabo Delgado. Now it becomes a law, and it is going to restrict and severely restrict vital information on the impact of the insurgency on a humanitarian crisis in our region. I do think government is concerned that its normalization narrative is falling apart with the current momentum in Cabo Delgado. It will do everything to push this narrative to get Total Energies in the LNG sector going again, and to open Mozambique, the Praia and Palma and invite international journalists is a show. It is not a reflection of what we are seeing in Cabo Delgado. And that is the concern. We have 4 new districts. Who will report these harsh realities? Government cannot shy away from it.
Yeah, I'm interested in understanding whether or not the reporting of terrorism in Mozambique has in any way impacted how officials in the country are able to deal with the insurgency. So has journalism actually gotten in the way of officials dealing with this problem?
I have not, Naledi, I've been following this insurgency since 2015 when we had the first rumblings. There is not one example where a reporting actually impeded government's ability to act. What is the reality at the matter? Let me call it that. Is that journalists have exposed a government narrative, first in denial, then pointing fingers to the Islamic State, and still at that level, the root causes, the facts of the matter that needs to be addressed in Cabo Delgado, and that makes government feel uncomfortable. Now, let me give you an example beyond the media.
Yeah.
If I get information and I want to tweet, because I think it's important for the public to know, I cannot tweet that because the person that provided me the information will be at risk of being arrested. This is how serious the legal implications are for Cabo Delgado. Who will tell the narrative of the communities of the internal displaced people? This law is of utmost concern.
Yeah, what's quite interesting is that terrorist bodies themselves operate very much with the media, don't they? Because they essentially use social media to grow their numbers, to reach young people. So when you don't have a matching of that, that should be of great concern, Jasmine.
Lady well said, and I think this is what we need to understand. Whereas previously with terrorism, they relied on the media to showcase their bloodthirst violence. Now the Islamic, I'm talking major Islamic terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, they had their own media networks, their own public weekly magazines, Al-Naba, Nashia, Amaq, where they claim credits. They rely on their own media to propagate their message. But the more they can talk, and we've seen with this with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, using Facebook, they are spreading their message. They are spreading their extremist ideas, and we need a counter narrative based on fact. And this is crucial. Based on fact. The Islamic State, for example, will seldom say something that cannot be linked to an actual development. Yeah. We cannot rely on rumors now.
Yeah, let's spread our view a little bit wider now. Ericino, I'm going to come back to you on this one. Is the issue of the coverage of terrorism being lacking a bigger issue on the continent, not just Mozambique? And where are some of those hot spots that we really need to look at how media is able to cover terrorism in Africa?
Well, I think that this issue, looking to the situation in Africa, has been part of the matters covered by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. In 2005 and 2015, some resolutions were approved relating to reporting terrorism in Africa. The critical point here is that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights uses governments not to let's say to use illegal interventions in what refers to terrorism, as to limit right to information, as to limit press freedom, as to pose unduly restrictions on the rights of journalists to report freely and indefinitely on the situation in the ground. So, as the situation in terms of using laws to limit the work of journalists has been out there for decades in Africa, that's why the African Union has approved these two resolutions in 2005 and 2015. And Mozambique, being party of the African Union, was supposed to follow those resolutions, and thus not limiting unduly the work of the journalists. As Jasmine was saying, it will from now on be very difficult for journalists to report on the situation, to tell the stories in the community based on their sources, on the researchers, on the humanitarian workers who are out there, who see the situation, who live the situation day to day. So now they will be afraid, now they will be feel treated to collaborate, to share information on those matters. So yeah, this is what I would say relating to this point. Actually, even considering that those sources may provide information and ask not to be named, the point will be the journalist and his the media houses as such, as the government or other state entity may go to the court and say that you have reported false information, you have violated the Terrorism Act, and it does have to deal with you in this and that way. So that one, of course, at the end of the day, will cause censorship on us, which is very problematic.
I want to bring it back home now. We've seen instances of ISIS's presence within South African borders, Jasmine, and I'm concerned around whether or not South African media houses are actually covering terrorism presence within South Africa.
Lady, I think that is a harsh reality, and we're talking at home now. If we look at South Africa, there were recent 3 articles published on financing and the presence of ISIS. I've written many articles on the presence of the Islamic State. But I think the problem comes in is a question of unfamiliarity with terrorism. So should we now wait for a first attack? God forbid. But the reality is that compared to crime, compared to corruption, there are other issues that's always more sensational in terms of selling and getting more followers on social media. And I think this is the problem, and this is the responsibility of the media to make sure that we have a balanced, factual reporting on the reality of what's happening in the region with the Islamic State finding a evolving footprint, the regional implications. And I think the media has an immense responsibility to publish these harsh realities. It will leave some politicians uncomfortable, but we're not here to get applaud. We must publish what is happening, and this is crucial. And I'm sorry to say, but our media and media houses are chasing numbers, they're chasing sensationalism, and terrorism just does not have that nice link to it that will give them more income as they want.
Yeah. Jasmine, you've said something quite frightening there. I mean, you've essentially said that we cannot wait for our first terrorist attack in South Africa. But we need to be able to counter even the information sharing of terrorism on the continent for us to deal with that issue. And I wonder, Ericino, if there are opportunities here for the industry, whether it be in Mozambique and other parts of the continent, then to counter these anti-terror bills that are being essentially passed by governments like the Mozambican government.
As I'm informed, some human rights organizations are already working on the matter, and some media organizations, for example, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, MISA, I understand it is doing some work on the matter, putting it clear that while it supports efforts aimed at fighting terrorism, it also safeguards and supports the fundamental rights, the rule of law, the democratic rule of law to be explicit, and in particular the relevance of a free media in a democratic society, even in cases where there are terrorism attacks or there are threats for such attacks in the case of South Africa, etc., etc. So the media community in the region, Mozambique, etc., is aware and they agree that this one is a setback in our fight for free media, for a, consolidated democratic relevance of the media sphere, But of course, as I said earlier, in the case of Mozambique, the deal has been signed off by the president.
Yeah.
As such, is now a law, is now mandatory. But of course, us who find it to be problematic have to use democratic ways to try to convince the state apparatus, the government, not to implement such laws, or even to consider reviewing them as to align them with the international standards, the human rights standards, protocols which Mozambique is part of in this case. Yeah.
Jasmine, I want to wrap this up with you quickly before we go and end this discussion. We talked a little bit earlier about how terrorist groups themselves use media and social media to continue spreading their message and growing their numbers, particularly among young Africans. What are those telltale signs on social media, particularly that say you are being pulled in? Because essentially that's what happens.
That is what happens, and I think this is what I call from passivism to activism, where there is a movement to interest. How the youth gets trapped into this narrative differs from individual to individual, but broadly speaking, it relates to a frustration. I always say the primary activation of radicalism is the television set, where they see police beating up civilians, where they see governance failure, where they see there's a lack of employment or there's a lack of opportunity, and then the alternative message comes so much more pronounced. And that is when people start playing on social media, start showing an interest in this alternative opportunity, and before you know it, without the person realizing it, I've seen it in South Africa in 9 cases, where 5 of them had ignorant interest in what is being said, and they were caught up in radicalization. It's a complex process, but it's working. And this is the concern, Naledi. Let's take the Islamic State. I don't want to waste your time. The last 3 weeks in Al Naba had front page, let's call it articles, because that is their newspaper, if I can call it that, on the strategic value of Africa. Now, how do you counter that? By Iraqification, by deploying forces? You will not succeed. You can deploy 100,000 soldiers today in Cabo Delgado. You are not dealing with the root causes. It's set to fail. We need to shift this Iraqification mindset of military force to one where government realizes it's the day-to-day experiences of the individual that will determine radicalization, or thank you, not radicalization. I am, and I have my opportunity in the country where I am home. But it is concerning that a terror organization is spreading the strategic value of Africa.
And I think for South Africans, it's important to remember that we have our own troops deployed to Mozambique to deal with the insurgency, the growing insurgency in the country. Over 1,000, much more than 1,000. In fact, just last week we deployed even more soldiers there, and we've invested a lot in those resources as well. But let's leave that discussion there. Thank you so much to our guest, Jasmine Opperman, independent consultant for extremism in Southern Africa, and as well as Ercino de Salema, who is an advocate and journalist, speaking to us from Mozambique. Let's take a short break. When we return, we look at the move from analog to digital. Stay with us. Welcome back to Media and Society. So once again, the ever-anticipated switch from analog to digital terrestrial television is back in the spotlight, with the deadline now being the 30th of June. But just this Friday, the Communications Minister, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, held a briefing wherein she said that 5 provinces in the country have already been switched off, except economic hubs Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. Now, does this mean that continued poor connectivity will be seen in those provinces, Gauteng and KZN? And are set-top boxes ready and distributed sufficiently? Are we going to see many households lose access to information if their TVs go off? Or can we finally say that South Africa is ready to go digital? Let's take a look at this insert.
Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies Khumbudzo Ntshabeni says 5 provinces have fully completed broadcast digital migration and analog switch off in these provinces has already taken place. These provinces are Free State, Northern Cape, Northwest, Mpumalanga and Limpopo. However, it is now not clear when the national analog switch off will happen, as the matter awaits the Constitutional Court ruling. Should the court rule in favor of the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, the other 4 provinces, which is Gauteng, KZN, Western Cape and Eastern Cape, may also experience analog switch off even without completing broadcast digital migration.
5 provinces have already been switched off, 4 provinces have not been switched off. And what we are raising in this briefing is that this country, and you know for fact, this country has 2 economic hubs, which is Gauteng and KZN. The Gauteng and KZN have not been switched off and the networks remain congested. And they will not decongest until we switched off. When we switch off, Centec takes between a month and 6 weeks to complete the migration. So if we switch off by the 30th of June, Centec will then complete the D2D migration or the risk-taking by the 2nd week of August. And that spectrum will then be released.
The minister says the recent floods that have thwarted KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape have affected the installation of the set-top boxes for those indigent households qualifying for government-sponsored set-top boxes. Ntshabeni says as of 21st June 2022, a total of 109,270 beneficiary households remain unconnected in the 2 provinces. Ntshabeni further said government has enough set-top boxes, and she urged those households which needs them and are qualifying to apply.
It is not correct that every indigent person or every poor household is using an analog television, because digital televisions have been in the market in South Africa since 2012. And therefore, some households that are indigent are sitting on digital televisions. And if you have a digital television, you do not have to have a set-top box.
It seems the nation is now on the last hurdle before it makes the historic switch to the broadcasting digital migration and much anticipated release of spectrum throughout the country.
We have concluded analog switch off and migration for the SABC in the 5 provinces of Free State, Northern Cape, Northwest, Mpumalanga and Limpopo provinces. And I must indicate the migration those provinces are fully migrated, but the analog switch off was for the SABC. Therefore, ICASA will be able to release the high demand spectrum in these provinces as of the 1st of July 2022. We are therefore eagerly awaiting the Concord decision on the analog switch off days for us to conclude broadcast digital migration. This will allow us to release spectrum in Gauteng, Western Cape, KZN, Eastern Cape, and Eastern Cape. Unfortunately, until the analog switch off is concluded, the country's economic hubs of Gauteng and KZN will remain with poor network connectivity, with negative impact to the economy of the country and also to the general citizens of the country.
Velemseni Mtiane, SABC News, Johannesburg.
So 2 important questions here, right? And the first one is, if we really continue with the switch, are we cutting off the most vulnerable in our country from access to information? And the second question is, do South Africans even understand what the switch is about? So we went out to ask them if they understand what the switch from analog to digital terrestrial television even means.
Heard of a set-top box? To my knowledge, I've never heard of a set-top box, and I would like to know about that. Please elaborate. What is that?
In television, so my understanding is basically, like when we look at the DSTV, right? The box, the decoder box. That's when you basically connect the 2 channels together in order to get the feedback.
I'm guessing from olden styles of translating news to a more modern version.
I don't know. I won't lie. If I would say I know, I'll be lying. But I'm gonna research about that.
I'm not really sure, but my guess is, analog. Okay, digital, I think it's probably the normal television. Not really sure. and then maybe analog is, I don't know, the projector one.
I would say that maybe digital, meaning that it will be switching television to our cell phones. And then when it comes to analog, it's the traditional way of watching television, which is TV. And yeah, I don't know, I'm just guessing.
So let's be clear, those are young people who don't quite understand what this switch to DTT actually is. What more for our elders? We're going to unpack this discussion a little bit more after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Media and Society. Well, we continue our discussion around the switch from analog to digital terrestrial television. 5 provinces already switched off and many more to come. Well, to take this conversation further, we are joined by Michael Graaf, member of Right to Know Campaigns, a communication rights group. Michael, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. 5 provinces already switched off. What do you make of the timing of the switch off for these provinces? Were they ready?
Hello, ladies and viewers. Well, being only a volunteer activist and not having staff on the ground like as the minister does and the various companies do, the only real evidence I can point to is the claim by ETV that when the SABC analog channels were switched off in Free State and other places, the viewership of ETV, which remained on analog, climbed sharply, which sort of suggests that there are a lot of people who are still relying on analog. But, that's the only hard evidence I can point to.
Yeah. What do you make of the argument by the communications minister that Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal as economic hubs have not been switched yet because of their large numbers in those provinces?
Well, we'll have to take her word for it, but the evidence that I just quoted in the provinces that have been switched off would probably be repeated, when they switch off those provinces.
Yeah. Do you think this is a constitutional issue? I mean, I talked earlier about the right to access for information in South Africa. Is this switch to digital terrestrial television a constitutional dilemma for the country?
That is one level. But there's another level that we, as Right to Know, would like to draw attention to, which is the level of policy. The whole reason why there's such a time pressure to switch off the analog is to do with spectrum. The fact that they've just recently had a spectrum auction, and now companies that paid for spectrum want to start using it. But what we are saying is that actually the whole model of spectrum policy needs to change, because the technology exists for spectrum to be shared in a dynamic way. So the allocation of certain frequencies to certain companies over the whole country on an ongoing permanent basis or semi-permanent, it's outmoded and it's wasteful, There's not actually such a shortage of spectrum because many companies they're sitting on spectrum that they're not using in much of the country much of the time. So the warrant that was scrapped was actually the first step that we were going to take towards spectrum sharing, and we're very upset. We want to know why did they scrap that, because this was the beginning of the new model.
Yeah, but Minister Ntshabeni spoke on Friday, and one of the things that she talked about was the penetration of digital devices in the country now being great enough for us to be ready. I mean, and that's really what we need to be talking about. We've been talking DTT for over a decade now, but one would argue that we've seen enough digital penetration in the country.
Well, again, I have to rely on sort of anecdotal evidence and also visual evidence. When you see so many satellite dishes, even in informal settlements, you suspect that when the minister says penetration of digital devices, she's including people who have moved to satellite. And what's very interesting to me is that the cheapest form of satellite that the largest number of people are migrating to is OpenView, because you only pay for the set-top box and then you don't have a subscription cost. And it just happens that OpenView is owned by the same company as ETV, and it happens to be a company with good links to the ANC. So I find that very interesting.
That is quite interesting. Michael, just one more thing. I mentioned that we've been waiting for DTT for over a decade. We've seen deadlines set and deadlines missed. Do you think that we will see the 30th of June as a deadline actually met?
Well, it all depends on the power and influence of these companies that have paid for spectrum. If they can persuade the minister and the department and Centec and everybody to do the analog switch off, then it will happen, because they're demanding access to the spectrum that they've paid for. But as I said, we think that the whole conduct of the spectrum auction was wrong.
Yeah.
The loan shouldn't have been cancelled. So, we think there needs to be a bit of a reset in spectrum policy.
Let me step in quickly, because I'm just trying to take advantage of time here. We heard from South Africans a little bit earlier on in the show. We essentially asked them what they understood about the switch to digital terrestrial television. Very few of them could actually explain what it is. Do you think that we've done enough to inform South Africans, number one, about what the switchover is and even how to get those set-top boxes?
The problem is that we've been spending that money on publicity in dribs and drabs over the whole 10 years. 10 years ago, some millions were spent on billboards in the suburbs and townships announcing this digital switchover. Now, many people alive today weren't even born when it was first being announced. And, it's been announced continuously since then, but in dribs and drabs. They should have kept all the awareness budget until the last minute when it's actually happening.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to continue this discussion, and I imagine that it's going to be an ongoing one. We certainly will keep a close eye on it here on Media and Society. Thank you so much to our guest, Michael Graaf from Right to Know. And that's where we wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us here on Media and Society on SABC News. We'll be back with you again next week, Sunday, same time, same place. Have yourselves a blessed Sunday.